Agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Federal Election Commission, Alan Dickerson of the District of Columbia to be a member.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Alan Dickerson of the District of Columbia to be a member of the Federal Election Commission, signed by 17 senators as follows.
I ask the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I move to proceed to legislative session.
The question is on the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
I move to proceed to executive session and consider calendar 913.
The question is on the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Federal Election Commission, Shauna M. Broussard of Louisiana to be a member.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Shauna M. Broussard of Louisiana to be a member of the Federal Election Commission, signed by 17 senators as follows.
I send the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I move to proceed to legislative session.
The question is on the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
I move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar 914.
The question is on the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. And the motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Federal Election Commission, Sean J. Cooksey of Missouri to be a member.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Sean J. Cooksey of Missouri to be a member of the Federal Election Commission, signed by 17 senators as follows.
I ask consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that the Senate resume consideration of the Swartz nomination.
Without objection.
Okay. I suggest the Adams reform.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
President,
Democratic
are we in
leader.
a quorum?
We
I
are,
ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
without objection.
Now, Madam President, last night we received the sad news that a former colleague of ours, one of our finest, Paul Sarbanes, has passed away. While our time in the Senate only overlapped for one term, Senator Sarbanes made a deep impression. Known as the stealth senator, he was low-key but extremely effective, a leader on a wide-ranging group of issues from environmental stewardship to consumer privacy to anything having to do with his home state of Maryland. He was very soft-spoken, but he had determination like iron and worked and worked and worked on issue after issue till he achieved his goals. We mourn the passing of this beloved former colleague and this consummate senator. Now on COVID. Everyone knows we're entering the worst stretch of the COVID-19 pandemic. As the winter months force more Americans indoors, infections are up, hospitalizations are up, and the number of Americans dying from COVID is steadily and tragically increasing. The economic fallout from the latest wave of the virus will also be a huge challenge. According to one study, nearly 12 million renters will owe an average of nearly $6,000 in back rents and utilities in January. Even the conservative U.S. Chamber of Commerce is sounding the alarm about a double-dip recession if Congress does not pass another round of emergency federal relief before the end of the year. Unfortunately, our efforts to pass another emergency relief bill through the Senate have been stalled until now for one reason. The Republican leader has refused to compromise. Again today, we heard the same old song from the Republican leader. His position has not budged since March. First, he put the Senate on pause while the spread of the virus got worse and worse. Then, after pressure mounted, the Republican leader finally decided to put forward a series of bills that compromised only the things that the Republicans want. While the nation has been clamoring for a bipartisan solution, the Senate, under the leadership of the Republican leader, has only been allowed to vote on partisan Republican proposals, each of which has been sorely inadequate, and each of which has contained poison pills designed to ensure the bill's failure. The Republican leader never mentions those poison pills in his speeches to this chamber, where he excoriates Democrats for refusing to pass, quote, bipartisan legislation that everyone agrees on. But bipartisan does not mean Democrats must agree to whatever the Republican leader wants or whatever issues he picks. Bipartisan means both sides sitting down, finding an agreement. We all know that's the case. We have a Democratic House. They're going to need Democratic votes in the Senate. So Senate Democrats are simply asking the Republican leader to do one thing: sit down and negotiate. Now, since March, since Secretary Mnuchin and I negotiated the CARES bill, the Republican leader has constantly refused to sit down with Republicans and negotiate a bipartisan solution. He puts his bill with no Democratic input on the floor and says, take it or leave it. That is no way to get things done. It wasn't in April or May or June or July or August or September or November, and it isn't now. Speaker, we want the leader to sit down and negotiate so we can come up with a bipartisan proposal that can pass both the House and the Senate. And Speaker Pelosi and I have modified our proposal several times in an effort to meet our Republican counterparts in the middle. Last week, Speaker Pelosi and I went even further and agreed to use a bipartisan bill crafted by moderate senators from both sides of the aisle as a framework for the negotiations. We have not heard the same willingness from the Republican leader. However, there are some encouraging signs. The bipartisan group of senators and House members working on this latest proposal continues to make progress. I was encouraged to see the senator from Louisiana this weekend say he was hopeful the president would sign such an agreement. Let's use the work of the Gang of Eight as the basis for bipartisan negotiations and compromise. The bottom line, we have to get something done for the American people before the end of the year. We Democrats have been trying since the spring, back when Republicans were saying, quote, they did not feel the urgency of acting. I believe those were the leader's words. Well, it's going to take a sense of urgency now, Mr. Leader, and it's going to take a willingness to give a little, not just to put your bill on the floor and say take it or leave it. As I said, it's encouraging that some Republicans are already on that path. Hopefully, the Republican leader can catch up with the more fair-minded members of his caucus. Now on nominations, another matter. The incoming Biden administration continues to name candidates it will tap to lead cabinet agencies and other key positions in the federal government. Today, President-elect Biden introduced his health care team, including Dr. Fauci, who will stay on, thank God, as chief medical advisor, Dr. Vivek Murthy to serve as Surgeon General, Dr. Rochelle Walensky to head the CDC, and Javier Becerra, the Attorney General of California, to be the next Secretary of Health and Human Services. Like most of President Biden's selections so far, Mr. Becerra's nomination is groundbreaking. He would be the first Latino to ever run the Department of Health and Human Services. Now, these nominees, once confirmed, will face a monumental task. President-elect Biden will inherit a once-in-a-generation health care crisis, a crisis made worse by the Trump administration's lack of focus, competency, and consistency over the past year. By naming a deeply experienced and tested team of senior health care advisors, President-elect Biden is getting ready to right the ship and execute a whole-of-government approach to crushing the virus and providing affordable health care to all Americans. As safe and effective vaccines become available over the next year, President-elect Biden's team will also have to work with states and health care providers to get Americans vaccinated. To state the obvious, health care is going to be the #1 challenge when the new administration takes office. We're in the middle of a once-in-a-century public health crisis. Accordingly, President-elect Biden's team should be confirmed swiftly to ensure that no time is lost in the fight against the pandemic. Regrettably, there's a split screen this week between the seriousness of the incoming Biden administration and the activities of the Republican majority here in the Senate. On Tuesday, the Republican chairman of the Homeland Security Committee has invited Dr. Jane Orient to give testimony at a hearing in his committee. Dr. Orient is a member of the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons, a benign-sounding name that obscures some dangerous policies. According to the New York Times, Dr. Orient's association, quote, opposes government involvement in medicine and views federal vaccine mandates as a violation of human rights, unquote. Dr. Orient herself has expressed skepticism about coronavirus vaccines and continues to hawk hydroxychloroquine as COVID-19 treatment, following the lead of President Trump, who boosted the drug despite scientific evidence that it's ineffective. So while President Biden is nominating experienced, committed public servants to lead the administration's health care policy, the next administration's health care policy, the Republican majority is inviting prominent anti-vaxxers to Senate committee hearings. A study in contrasts, to say the least. After one of the most difficult years in recent memory, we finally have a light at the end of the tunnel in the discovery of several effective and safe vaccines. They're the best chance we have of ending the terrible scourge of this disease and getting our lives back to normal. And yet, the effectiveness of the vaccine only matters insofar as the number of Americans who are willing to take it. The more Senate Republicans dip their toes into the water of these anti-science, anti-vax conspiracy theories, the more damage it does to our country. Public figures at all levels should be building up confidence in a vaccine, not giving a platform to those who would undermine it. The senator from Wisconsin, the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee, should revoke his invitation to Dr. Orient. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Texas.
Madam President, I came to the floor to talk about some other things, but I just want to say in response to our friend, the Democratic leader, it sounds to me that he's got a case of do as I say, not as I do when it comes to COVID-19 relief bills. If my memory serves me correctly, he has led the effort to block the Senate's consideration of 5 different COVID-19 relief bills. Speaker Pelosi has made the incredible statement that nothing is better than something when it comes to COVID-19 relief. That's easy to say when you're still getting a paycheck, when you've got a job you can go do and you can provide for your family and you have access to health care. But for the millions of Americans who suffered through this pandemic, those are words that sound a lot like Marie Antoinette. Let them eat cake. I mention this because I've been around this place long enough to know that unless you tell people the whole story, too often they believe the talking points and the half story, the incomplete story, like we heard from the Democratic leader. It is shameful that after passing 4 separate COVID-19 relief bills, including the CARES Act through the end of March, on virtually unanimous basis, that Speaker Pelosi chose to pass a partisan bill out of the House, the HEROES bill, for another $3 trillion, including things like tax breaks for millionaires and billionaires in New York and San Francisco, unrelated to the COVID-19 relief bill that we needed. So I applaud the group of bipartisan senators who've been working now after the election to try to come up with the relief, rather than kicking this can down the road and leaving people in the lurch during the Christmas holiday season. And then when it comes to the vaccine, I have no doubt that the incoming administration is going to claim complete credit for producing a vaccine and getting this virus in the rearview mirror. I understand why they would be tempted to do so, but it is because of the bipartisan action that Congress has taken with this administration through Operation Warp Speed that we've seen our world-class scientists come up with safe and effective, I hope, soon-to-be certified vaccines by the Food and Drug Administration, and people can begin to start getting vaccinated by the middle of this month. That is a modern-day miracle. We should all be proud of it, but it should not be part of a partisan campaign now after we've had an election on November the 3rd. I wish our friends would get out of the campaign mode and get into the governing mode. We've got important work we need to do here. And part of that, Madam President, is the Jenna Quinn law. This bipartisan piece of legislation that I introduced with Senator Hassan over a year and a half ago to help identify and stop child sexual abuse in communities across our country has passed the Senate unanimously, but stuck in the House of Representatives. Nationwide, there are more than 42,000 survivors of child sexual abuse, adults now. 42 million adult survivors of child sexual abuse. Sadly, these victims often stay silent for days, months, years, even a lifetime. As a result, they and countless other victims continue to be abused. We need to stop this cycle as quickly as possible, and that's why the Jenna Quinn law is so important. It's modeled after a 2009 Texas law, which requires teachers and caregivers and other adults who work with children receive training on how to identify and report child sexual abuse. After the Texas law passed in 2009, one study found educators reported child sexual abuse at a rate almost 4 times greater after the training than they got during their pre-training career. Jenna Quinn herself tells the story of her own mother saying, "If I'd just known you were showing all the classic symptoms of a victim of child sexual abuse, I would have intervened sooner." Well, the 2009 Texas law was one of the first to mandate this training, and now more than half of all the states have adopted a form of Jenna's law. So you may ask, why do we need to pass a federal law? Well, the states don't have the funding for the training, and that's what the Jenna Quinn law provides. It allows the current Department of Health and Human Services grant funds to be used for this specialized training. This bill has received the support of every member of the Senate Help Committee, Republicans and Democrats, not surprisingly, and it's passed the Senate unanimously. But it's been months and we're still waiting for the House of Representatives to act. Just last week, House Democrats under Speaker Pelosi did find time to act on a bill to decriminalize marijuana, on a bill to deal with large cats, the Tiger King bill. But did they have time to provide assistance to small businesses? Did they find time to pass bipartisan COVID-19 relief? Did they find time to pass the Jenna Quinn law, which I'm sure if put on their suspension calendar would pass very quickly and go to the president for his signature? In a move that defies common sense, the chairman of the Education and Labor Committee in the House, Congressman Bobby Scott, is blocking the Jenna Quinn law. He voted to decriminalize marijuana. He voted to ban the private ownership of big cats, but he won't even let the Jenna Quinn law receive an up or down vote on the floor of the House of Representatives. Well, if you're confused by the logic of this move, you're not alone, especially because the urgency for this legislation has only grown during the pandemic. As families have stayed at home as part of the mitigation efforts, their lives have been filled with a range of new stressors: loss of income, isolation, health anxiety, and the stress of teaching children at home can test even the healthiest families and relationships. But they also put children at a higher risk for abuse and neglect. In April of this year, nationwide reports of abuse or neglect dropped an average of 40% compared to the same time last year. Now, ordinarily you would say, well, that's good news, but the reason why the reports of abuse and neglect have dropped is because children have not been going to their classrooms, where the teachers who train in identifying these signs and symptoms can see them and help them by intervening. In 2018, 2/3 of the reports of child abuse were submitted by people who came in contact with children as part of their jobs. I've mentioned teachers, counselors, caregivers, but also police officers, lawyers, social services, but predominantly teachers who see these children at school. Teachers, education professionals, and other support staff at schools, like bus drivers, are responsible for more than half of the reports of child abuse. But as I said, with children home during the pandemic, out of sight from their teachers and other adults that they would otherwise see on a routine basis, abuse is becoming more difficult to identify and report. Not because it's not happening, but because these children are having to suffer silently, living with, perhaps locked down with, their abuser. As the stresses of the pandemic and the lack of reporting take a violent toll on our children across the country, it is time for action. Not excuses, not decriminalizing marijuana, not a Tiger King bill, but passing legislation that will actually make their lives better, give them some hope. Not action at some time in the future, but now. And there's one person in the House of Representatives that's holding that up right now, and that's Chairman Scott. Children are suffering every day, Madam President. They're not worried about politics or whether Chairman Scott has the leverage he needs to advance a larger partisan bill later on next year. These victims are worried about their own safety. They're worried about how much longer will it be till some adult identifies my abuse and gets me out of this abusive relationship, gets me out of a living nightmare. Well, the sort of mindless obstruction we're seeing from Chairman Scott in the House exemplifies everything people loathe about Congress. Holding up a bill to prevent child sexual abuse as a means to gain political leverage for a bigger partisan bill. It's just shameful. Let's call it what it is, shameful. It's time for Chairman Scott to stop blocking the Jenna Quinn law so we can provide the life-saving training to the men and women most likely to stop the cycle of child sexual abuse. And finally, Madam President, last week here on the Senate floor, I spoke briefly about our retiring colleague, Senator Mike Enzi from Wyoming, and some wisdom he imparted to me shortly after I arrived in the Senate. Something he calls the 80-20 rule. As our friend from Wyoming told me, you're never going to agree or disagree with somebody 100% of the time, but that doesn't mean you can't get important work done. So instead of just focusing on the 20% you can't agree on, look at the 80% you can agree on. I hope all of our colleagues will remember this formula for success in the coming days as we work to deliver another round of coronavirus relief for the American people. It's clear we're never going to agree 100% of the time on what that bill should look like, but I bet we can agree on 80%, and we ought to get that 80% done. We all believe that additional funding for our schools is necessary to keep our students and teachers healthy and kids on track for a good education, that American workers who had the rug pulled out from under them earlier this year deserve additional support, that a second round of job-saving Paycheck Protection Program funds would help even more workers and small businesses, and that another investment in vaccine distribution is essential to bringing this pandemic to an end. Last week, Leader McConnell announced progress in the negotiations to pass another bill by the end of the year. He's spoken with the President's team and the Speaker, and there are hopeful signs. There appears to be a path forward on this legislation that could clear both chambers and receive the signature of the President, and I hope we will follow that path to a constructive conclusion. As I said last week, the best Christmas present we could give the American people would be to work together in a bipartisan way to provide that relief. We need an outcome, and to get there, it's going to take compromise. It's going to take the 80-20 rule. This process requires input and agreement from our colleagues in the Senate, the House, and the White House, as does all legislation. But my constituents, and I dare say all Americans, are fed up with the dysfunction they see and the partisanship that is for no real purpose that has delayed this COVID-19 relief bill for months. It's time to reach an agreement and deliver yet another round of coronavirus relief for the American people.
Madam President,
Senator from Idaho.
Bill Collaborative, and welcome the opportunity to be a part of the CBC's official launch in 2008. I tracked the group's progress through dedicating a member of my staff to being a part of its discussions, focused on resolving long-standing concerns and achieving land management decisions and fostering communication among different interest groups. The remarkable landscape it works to enhance encompasses forest lands providing habitat for treasured wildlife and anadromous fish species, resources for local communities, including timber, livestock, grazing, and mining, and natural carbon sinks that help our planet. The Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest spans 4 million acres. 3 rivers flow through the forest, providing important water resources, outstanding fishing, and other recreational opportunities. It is truly a remarkable place. And the group's work is far from easy, as there is a lot at stake. The good news is that we're hearing reports of remarkable achievements being made on the forests. The Nez Perce Clearwater National Forests have received 3 significant recognitions this year alone that highlight cooperative restoration work. A Regional Foresters Award for fostering partnership and volunteerism, a Chiefs Award for delivering benefits to the public, and an Undersecretary's Award for customer service for Forests Historic Routes projects. Through the Historic Routes projects, the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest dedicated approximately $1 million of retained receipt from stewardship contracts to improve water quality through historically sensitive maintenance along 3 historic roadways, the Lolo Motorway, the Elk City Wagon Road, and the Magruder Road, that attract visitors from all over the country. Project leaders, recognizing the importance of these routes to the local economy and historical significance, have partnered with local groups and the University of Idaho to include digital interpretation that is accessible even in locations without internet service. The project has also been supported through the Secure Rural Schools Resource Advisory Committee to assist with the maintenance. Stewardship contracts have also been used on the Nez Perce Clearwater Forest to enable the Forest Service to accomplish vegetation and watershed restoration. By leveraging this program with other partnerships and funding sources, the forests are able to have a truly integrated restoration program. Stewardship contracts have enabled fuels and weed treatment, watershed protection and restoration, road maintenance, and enhancements such as the removal of wire fencing to help wildlife. A total of 536 miles of streams have been restored on the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest, resulting in the forest being ranked 4th nationwide in miles of streams restored. The forests have a strong partnership with the Nez Perce tribe, which contributes greatly to its watershed restoration accomplishments. At the same time, priorities of much-needed restoration of landscapes, including water quality improvements, are also providing a supply of raw materials to our local mills. In fact, the forests are the 5th in the nation in providing wood products for purchase. More work is underway to address significant challenges, but this is the direction we need to continue to go in delivering long-term results. I commend all those involved in this effort for their hard and exemplary work improving our treasured landscapes. Also, a Good Neighbor Authority program coordinated by the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest and the Idaho Department of Lands was recognized with the 2017 Regional Forester Awards. Through the program, forest management has supported fuels reduction and watershed restoration. Further, the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest recently signed a Good Neighbor Authority agreement with the Idaho Department of Fish and Game. This will enable the forest and the Idaho Department of Fish and Game to work more seamlessly as they collaborate on projects to enhance wildlife habitat, such as aspen restoration. Statewide, the Idaho Department of Lands reports the agency is utilizing Good Neighbor Authority to partner with national forests in Idaho to expedite projects focused on fuels reduction, forest health improvements, and watershed health. According to an IDL summary from January of this year, the program has enabled the treatment of 4,800 acres through 50 service contracts at a total value of over $3 million to the private sector to treat weed infestation, reduce fuels, complete road repairs, and support project planning and monitoring. Other collaborative efforts have laid strong groundwork or follow in the footsteps of collaborative work such as this. In Idaho, we have succeeded with public lands projects such as the Owyhee Initiative and are hard at work in others such as the Kootenai Valley Resource Initiative, the Payette Forest Coalition, the Boise Forest Coalition, and others, including our governor's Shared Stewardship Task Force. And I also look forward to the soon-to-be-completed recommendation of the governor's Salmon Work Group. Federal policy must empower collaboration and forest health. As senators and shared stewards of these natural resources, we must continuously work to ensure federal statute and policy empowers collaborative efforts and forest health projects. In 2003, I was proud to work with my congressional colleagues, including Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon and many others, to enact the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, or HFRA, to help provide the U.S. Forest Service with the tools needed to do the necessary work on the ground to restore our forests to health and reduce the threat of a catastrophic wildfire to our communities and ecosystems. The HFRA was designed to encourage fuel reduction efforts, protect old-growth forests, enhance water quality, promote community-based land management and public involvement in forest management, and address insect and disease problems. The HFRA has promoted stewardship contracting projects which incorporate public-private partnerships emphasizing more localized forest management. In the years since the enactment of the HFRA, Congress has enacted additional legislation to advance forest health. For example, in the 2014 Farm Bill, we included permanent authority for stewardship contracting and the authorization of Good Neighbor Authority. Good Neighbor Authority expanded the federal government's ability to partner with state foresters on restoration projects, including bark beetle treatments across state and federal boundaries. Subsequently, the 2018 Farm Bill included an expansion of Good Neighbor Authority. It credited with increasing the pace and scale of forest restoration projects across Idaho. The 2018 Farm Bill also importantly included a 10-year reauthorization of the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, which has enabled the expansion of active collaboration and land use groups in Idaho. The program encourages large-scale, that's 50,000 plus acres, collaborative, science-based forest restoration projects in a way that encourages environmental and economic sustainability. The U.S. Forest Service reported that in the first 10 years of the program, the CFLRP opportunities brought together more than 420 organizations to engage in local collaboratives. And CFLRP projects treated 3.8 million acres to reduce wildfire risk. The CFLRP has supported collaborative work of the Clearwater Basin Collaborative and the Nez Perce Clearwater Forest to restore conditions within the 1.4 million acre Selway Middle Fork ecosystem. Through stream improvements, the replacement of culverts, preventing fish passage, road and trail maintenance, and the reduction of wildfire fuel loads. Also, the reauthorized Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program has 2 newly approved projects in Idaho, with 1 in each region. Region 1 encompasses the Panhandle National Forest, and in Regional 4, it encompasses the Payette and Boise National Forests. And we can't let up in making progress on wildfires. The severely smoke-clogged skies this fire season made the impacts of the fires that have decimated wildlands and communities for years nearly unescapable. As we think about the lives and livelihood lost to wildfires, we must continue to work to enact bipartisan forest management reform to build on the progress made in recent years to ensure federal land agencies have the tools they need to protect communities from deadly wildfires by improving the health of our forests. Bipartisan legislation pending in this Senate would increase the active management of federal forests, cut red tape, reduce frivolous litigation, and advance fire risk reduction. Senators Steve Daines of Montana and Dianne Feinstein of California worked across party lines for months to negotiate the details of the bipartisan Emergency Wildfire and Public Safety Act. Enactment of sensible bipartisan legislation such as this, which is also co-sponsored by myself and my fellow senator colleague from Idaho, Jim Risch, can better enable land managers to reduce wildfire risk and respond effectively to an increasingly virulent wildfire reality. This will build on the successful enactment of bipartisan legislation to enable federal agencies to respond to wildfires as they would to other natural disasters and end the practice of fire borrowing. Forests make up 39% of the land in my home state of Idaho. They are key to air and water quality and sustain wildlife habitat and recreational opportunities. They support communities through wood and paper product jobs and recreation dollars. They are the backdrop and the means for unparalleled quality of life. Their vitality hinges on their effective management. I'm encouraged by the achievements on the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forests, and I urge continued collaborative efforts to address often contentious but necessary natural resource challenges and the enactment of federal law that bolsters these collaborative efforts for the betterment of all of our communities. Thank you, Madam President, and I yield the floor.
Oh, Marcia.
Madam President.
Senator from Tennessee.
Thank you, Madam President. Over the past few months, there are many of us in this chamber that have taken big tech to task over their shady and biased business practices. In more than one hearing, we've grilled them on the privacy, censorship, and antitrust concerns that have allowed us to keep these CEOs in the hot seat. And that grilling has taken place by those of us on either side of the aisle. And these are big, big problems, and they're not going to disappear at the end of this Congress. These are problems that are going to be around. But one of the advantages of having these companies like Facebook and Twitter and Google living in our phones and in our homes is that it's much harder for oppressive governments and global bad actors to hide their crimes from the rest of the world. Just last year, about this time, the freedom fighters in Hong Kong, and this is a poster that I used on the floor just about this time of year, December 9th, 2019. And it shows the freedom fighters in Hong Kong, shows how they were making their case. We do not want to become like China. These freedom fighters in Hong Kong captured our attention when they filled the streets and demanded an end to the Chinese Communist Party's terrible crackdowns on free speech and expression. And while the coverage in the 24-hour news cycle definitely made an impact, it was the millions of tweets and Facebook posts and videos and blog posts that turned their movement into a collective global outcry for an end to violence and terror in Hong Kong. You see, people saw what was happening there. They saw it in real time. And even if they didn't fully understand the politics behind these protests, they knew that the disproportionate response by the Chinese government to stamp out these protests was wrong. As those posts flowed out of Hong Kong, support flowed right back in. And having spoken with many of these brave activists, it really meant the world to them that they were hearing from us. But while all of this was happening, something else some counter messaging, if you will, was flowing from Beijing. It was a message of total capitulation sent by corporations, sports organizations, the mainstream media, and even powerful national and world leaders. They were all trying to keep the peace on behalf of their own self-interest, but as the days and weeks passed by, their blinders became more and more obvious. By that time, the online activist community had put the Chinese Communist Party's crimes on full display. What started as a debate on free speech and political autonomy morphed into a full indictment of the Chinese Communist Party's crimes against humanity, against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, in Tibet, and Inner Mongolia, and all across mainland China. Thanks to internet freedom efforts made possible by the Open Technology Fund, tweets and videos describing the Chinese Communist Party's intolerance of dissent escaped the Great Firewall and made its way into Western news feeds. The spread of the coronavirus tore away the veil covering Beijing's corrupt relationship with the World Health Organization and other international organizations and revealed their scandalous cover-up of the virus's origins. All that truth right on our phones, right on our iPads and computer screens, on every screen in the house. But unfortunately for the millions suffering under the horrors of communism, truth didn't win the day. The people with the most responsibilities to speak up stayed silent because they were fearful of retaliation. It was too politically charged, too economically risky. Someone might take their criticisms the wrong way. And well, we can't have that now, can we? I know from personal experience what it's like to have the Chinese Communist Party and their allies retaliate against you. Once you speak up, you're going to get it from all sides. Just last week, a member of the Chinese state media, so for all intents and purposes, I would suggest this is a propaganda minister for the Chinese Communist Party. Well, he decided that he had had enough of what we're doing here in Washington to expose Chinese aggression and fired off a series of vile, sexist tweets while conspicuously avoiding the issue at hand. Sounds fairly familiar. Attack the person, attack the messenger. But the thing is, Madam President, he was just mirroring the tactics used by his government. Beijing is all too happy to prey upon the ignorance of their massive online audience and encourage accusations of racism or xenophobia as the only acceptable response to evidence documenting their own racist, repressive politics. And that right there is how you end up with repressive regimes like the one in China gaining so much power on the global stage, when those who should know better allow their adversaries to cow them into silence. Madam President, I appreciate the importance of diplomacy, but diplomacy is meaningless without consequences. Activists, by their very nature, rise and fall based on their willingness to speak truth to power when the most influential among us allow evil regimes to escape those consequences. Today, I call on my colleagues to follow their example and use their work in this chamber to speak truth to power about the crimes of the Chinese Communist Party. We no longer have any excuse not to. If you want proof, pull out your phones and listen to what activists in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, in mainland China are telling you, or better yet, listen to what some of your colleagues are telling you. Hong Kong activist Joshua Wong currently sits in jail for the crime of criticizing his government. Madam President, I repeat this. Hong Kong activist, a young freedom fighter, Joshua Wong, is in jail because he criticized the Chinese Communist Party. He criticized his government. His sentencing barely managed a blip on the radar here. Another Hong Kong activist, Jimmy Lai, was denied bail during his own prosecution specifically because his online newspaper revealed the truths of the Chinese Communist Party's chokehold on their own people. The CCP cut off access to his corporate accounts and those of his employees. So much for Hong Kong's free press. Jimmy Lai and Joshua Wong live in Hong Kong. In June, the Senate passed a resolution condemning the CCP's repression of speech and expression in Hong Kong. These protests are still happening. Authoritarian crackdowns are still happening. We must keep speaking about this. In Xinjiang, CCP forces are systematically targeting and eliminating the Uyghur Muslim population through mass surveillance, population control, and incarceration in internment camps. Yes, you heard me, internment camps. It should make your skin crawl to hear that today, in 2020, this is happening. Last month, I joined my colleagues, Senator Cornyn and Senator Menendez, in supporting a bipartisan resolution to finally recognize that the Chinese government is doing in Xinjiang constitutes a genocide. If you're looking for a reason to start speaking out, I can't think of a better way to get started. Speak up on that. Support this resolution, which would not only urge the White House to take action against Beijing, but also urge national governments and organizations to get their heads out of the sand and tear away, piece by piece, China's disastrous influence over the global political economy, which is highlighted by the success of the Communist Party's Belt and Road Initiative. I will add, Madam President, I was thrilled today with Secretary Pompeo's tweet regarding that he is once again re-upping the countries of concern under the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998. China is on this list, as well they should be, as they continue to infringe on religious liberty. And they do engage in systematic, ongoing, egregious religious freedom violations. They're doing it every day, and the world is watching. I tell you, I could monopolize this floor for the next week and lay out every opportunity we have to stand up for the cause of freedom and speak truth to power about the crimes of the Chinese Communist Party. Here is a white paper that I unveiled earlier this year, and there are over 100 specific paths toward how we as a nation unravel the relationship that we have right now with China. The paper is only 52 pages long. It's a short version, and I would encourage one and all to take a look at it and to think about how it is that we got to this point where an influential government active in many major international bodies, including as of next year, China will be in the UN Human Rights Council, how can this government perpetrate a genocide against minorities and get away with it because of the appalling cowardice of those who bear witness and choose to do nothing? I yield the floor. And note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Just take out the very top of her answer and pick her up in the middle of her first answer. Yeah, maybe she's probably not. I'm asking her if she can hear us. Probably not. All right, why don't we go back to the Slack? Because yeah, if you take the question and even like the very first of what she did, I think we'll be good. Cool.
Mr. President,
The senator from Wyoming is recognized.
I'd ask that the quorum call be waived,
Without objection.
and I'd ask unanimous consent that the mandatory quorum also be waived.
Without objection.
I'd ask unanimous consent to start the vote now.
Without objection. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture. By unanimous consent,
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Stephen Sidney Schwartz of Virginia to be a judge of the United States Court of Federal Claims, signed by 17 senators.
thank you. By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Stephen Sidney Schwartz of Virginia to be a judge of the United States Court of Federal Claims shall be brought to a close. The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman. Yes. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gardner. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jones. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mrs. Leffler. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Paul. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Bozeman, Enzi, Gardner, Grassley, Kennedy, Rubio, Sass, Sullivan. Senators voting in the negative: Cantwell, Kelly, Markey, Menendez, Peters, Shaheen, Stabenow, Udall, Van Hollen. White House. Mr. Bennett, no. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mrs. Hyde Smith, aye. Mr. Reed, no. Ms. Duckworth, no. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, no. Mr. Cotton, aye. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Leahy, no. Mr. Schumer, no. Ms. Smith, no. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Schatz, no. Mr. Murphy, no. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Booker, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Tillis, aye. Miss Ernst, aye. Mr. Casey, no. Mrs. Murray, no. Miss Cinema, no. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Carper, no. Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Mr. Kane, no. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Durbin, no. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Manchin, no. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Romney, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Alexander, aye. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. King, no. Mr. Jones, no. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Brown, no. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn. Aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune. Aye. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr. Aye. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren. No. Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan. No. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn. Aye. Ms. Rosen. Ms. Rosen. No. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee. Aye. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy. Aye. Mr. Graham. Aye. Mr. Blunt. Aye.